So I'm going to be speaking sequentially about race, oppression, and freedom. But of course, each of these concepts are interrelated. And although I've got these three separate topics, you'll see how they're connected, hopefully, in each of the sections as I speak. Since the killing of George Floyd, there has been a renewed opening up of consciousness to the workings of systemic racism and a resistance to it. I am predominantly speaking for myself tonight. I'm not speaking as a representative of all people of colour. But I am addressing myself, I hope, to the concerns, some of the concerns that might be with us. I'm looking for meaningful ways to live, love, and work as a free human being, alongside those, and I'll use this term in inverted commas, white allies, in the struggle against racism for social justice. And I use the term white in inverted commas for reasons which you will hopefully discern as I go through my talk. Just as I probably use the term black in inverted commas when I use it to refer to myself. Again, something else which will become apparent as the reasons for that will become apparent as I go through my talk. I'd also like to say, before I begin the substantive part of what I have to say, that much of what I feel is said with conviction. Well, I think everything that I say is said with conviction, but it's also tentative, emergent, and provisional. We're in such a turbulent time, and some of the conversations that we're having are unprecedented, I believe, particularly in the profile and the impact of these conversations, that I am open to other people's thinking and to how that might influence the way that I think as well. I'm also very aware of the generational gap between myself and the young people who are for the first time coming into this struggle. I'm mindful of my own daughters. I've got two daughters who are in their 30s. They're both professional women. But it is the first time in our lives that we have started speaking about our respective experiences of racism. Only last week, my daughters revealed to me that the first time they became aware of structural racism was when they went to university. It wasn't until then that they realized that society saw them as belonging to a disadvantaged minority. And not only have they been, as the rest of us, been traumatized by seeing the video of, I mean, I have to say I haven't watched it. I've seen a still of the photograph with the policeman's knee on his neck, but I haven't watched the video and I'm not prepared to put myself through that. But they've seen this video in the circles on social media where they occupy. There is a constant stream of such material, and they feel deeply traumatized by all of this. And racism is a form of trauma. And one of the things I feel very strongly is that we need to learn how to remain psychologically safe at the same time as to have these conversations, to navigate the shockwaves that are created by systemic racism and by our resistance to it. You know, how do we have conversations across the racial divide created between human beings when for many white people, such conversations trigger shame, may trigger denial, and these sorts of responses, of course, shut down conversation and make it very difficult to have conversations which are absolutely necessary. So before I again, one more thing I'd like to sort of share before I get into the main topic of my talk is a little bit about my social political history, because it's very pertinent in the way in which I see race. My social consciousness was first evoked when I decided to become a teacher in the summer holiday between my second and third year at university. The Brixton riots erupted onto the TV screens while I was at university in Aberystwyth. And it was these scenes that motivated me to go into education. And I very much went into it with a sort of mission for social change. A bit ironic, really, when you think of where we are now, all these years later. My political activism began with the vote that I cast in the general election of 1979, which brought in Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. I remember being opposed to the war in Argentina, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I attended miners' picket lines in the mornings before I went to work at my school when I was in the first year as a teacher in 1982, I think, 83, 84 that was. I was involved in the struggle to advance the rights of the Palestinian people in the 90s, in the protests against war on Iraq. And throughout my life as an education professional, 29 years I spent in schools, all my work was informed by a social justice values. During my mid-40s, I dropped out of active sort of political work, but my commitment to social justice has remained and has re-emerged in the work that I'm currently doing. In my 6th decade, I was 60 on the 1st of April this year. And it is my determination as part of my legacy to use my voice in whatever way I can to create a space for difficult conversations in the knowledge of how difficult it is to have these conversations about racism. These conversations are deeply personal to me, but I know the importance of being able to transmute the raw emotional trauma of racism into something conscious, social, and political. And this all informs what I'm going to say to you tonight. I think it's really important to understand racism and its link to politics and economics. And I do believe that as a coach and coaching for social change has a unique role to play in helping to create spaces and mediating these difficult conversations. So let's talk about race. In sharing my thoughts with you, I've got 3 questions in my mind. In the context of systemic racism, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be Black? And what does it mean to be free? Those of us who have made a point of educating ourselves on this question, know that the history of racialization as we currently experience it dates back to the era of the European colonization and empire building of the 19th to of the 17th to 19th century. Race as an ideology developed in order to justify the brutalization of human beings with brown skins and to function as a source of social control amongst the white populations of the empire building nations. And in that way was born the socially constructed concept of white people, consciously built on deep and sublimated cultural associations of whiteness with purity, beauty, innocence, and equally building on the sublimated associations of blackness with things that are evil, to be shunned or feared. None of this is new to people who have educated ourselves on this question. These associations tap into primal fears that can be reliably triggered for purposes of social and political control. However, these responses can also equally be overridden by collective critical consciousness. Consciousness that is developed as a form of resistance to oppressive practices built on systemic racism. And in this way, critical collective consciousness is a practice of freedom. And I can say this because of my own experience of consciously adopting the identity of Black as an act of resistance. I became aware of the Black consciousness movement through the work and words of Steve Biko. I don't know how many of you have a memory that goes back to the struggle against apartheid and the role of Black consciousness in that struggle. Steve Biko was a leader of the Black liberation movement. He was murdered by the Afrikaans state that was in power at the time. And his concern was to free the minds of Black people from the internalized oppression created by constantly seeing ourselves through the eyes of the white gaze. This term, white gaze, stands for the process by which people of color come to see themselves as victims, as dehumanized bodies, alienated from themselves. It was he who coined the term Black is beautiful. For him, Black was not a matter of skin pigmentation. It's a reflection of a mental attitude, an attitude of mind. On the other side of that, from a commentary I read of a book review, I'll mention the book in a moment, is this idea that whiteness is also not a skin color. It's a performance of privilege. The book that this commentator was reviewing is a book called How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff. And I recommend it to anyone who's interested in exploring these issues. But one of the things I found interesting, particularly as a Black woman who married a white man of Irish descent, both my daughters have me, a Black mother, and a white, in inverted commas, father. And I mentioned this in the context as well of what they said about only feeling that they encountered systemic racism or had any concept of themselves as being disadvantaged when they went to university. They went outside of their community, outside of their loving, nurturing family into wider society. For me then, as my Black identity is not a form of cultural identification or racial identification, it's a reclamation, reclaiming that word from its association with race, and putting it into the context of a strategy for fully exercising my right to define who I am within the context of a racist society. Sorry, my notes have got a bit out of order. Just pardon me for a moment. Culturally or ethnically, I see myself as Jamaican. I was born in Jamaica. As British, I have a British passport and British citizenship. As European, I feel strongly, for some reason, European. Well, for a very distinct reason, but I don't have time to explain that. I feel European. And I feel myself to be a citizen of the world. And this citizenship entitles me to engage as a free thinking human being with all the riches that world culture has to offer me. My history does not begin and end with slavery and the ongoing brutalization, marginalization, and discrimination against people of colour. It is a history also of achievement, reclaiming things lost, and of unbroken resistance. I see this process of reclamation, of resistance, as a practice of freedom. So let's now talk about oppression. This section is led by the question, what kind of critical consciousness do we need to develop today for this struggle that has re-emerged against systemic racism, specifically during this period of pandemic? And I do believe that it's not accidental that we're beginning to embrace some of these conversations at this time, because the pandemic has shed a white light on systemic inequalities as a whole, and specifically on how those systemic inequalities affect the most vulnerable members of society, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and particularly people of colour. And it's won allies for that reason amongst white people. I don't particularly like that term, but I have to use it for convenience. And I believe that this is important because I include the white amongst the people who are oppressed. I believe white people are also oppressed by racist practices, by racist ideology. I believe there is a form of psychological oppression there. And systemic racism as a social problem cuts both ways. And it's also a political problem. If we take Brexit and Trump, I'll try and give you two brief examples of this. In the UK, the political right were able to trigger the ancient race tropes that successfully allowed them to transfer focus away from the effects of austerity that were affecting the poor, not only the poor, that were affecting swathes of society, to deflect that attention onto migrants, refugees, and the settled ethnic minority communities in this country. In the US, the Republican right has successfully triggered poor white working class communities to vote against the extension of medical insurance, known as Obamacare, from which they themselves would benefit in order to cut out access to poor working class people of colour. The only interests served by this, of course, are the interests of the already rich and powerful. So this dimension, the economic and political dimension, I refer to these examples in order to demonstrate what I refer to as the double-edged sword of systemic racism. There is, of course, I believe, despite this unity of interests, there is the moral and ethical dimension of systemic racism and the links to cultural identity. I think it's particularly hard to have the moral and ethical conversations about racism, because they do trigger shame and they can trigger denial. Because whiteness, as with blackness, has become complicated with issues of culture and ethnic identity. Very often when we talk about whiteness in relation to racism, we appear to be questioning somebody's identity, questioning their moral framework. And I would say that primarily, although there is a moral dimension, there is an ethical dimension, what I particularly want to shed light on is the ideological impact of racism, the nature of systemic racism as an ideology, as a supremacist ideology, and the way that it undermines social justice across society for all people. Some ideas oppress and some ideas liberate. And we need to be able to see them for what they are and how they operate. So freedom, what does freedom mean for me? For me, it means asserting myself as a Black woman on the basis of this sense of critical collective consciousness. It's liberating for me. However, I also feel its limitations. It is not full freedom. The labels that lump us together in undifferentiated masses, the term people of colour, for example, the term Black people, the term white people, none of these terms express the rich complexity of who we are, of how we live, who we love, or our aspirations. Yes, I am proud to sit here before you as a conscious, educated, and yes, privileged Black woman, confidently using my voice as a practice of freedom. But I do not want to be the Black woman in the room to satisfy the idle curiosity of those who see me as other, to be patronized or turned into an expert on race, or to be put into any other box other than the ones that I choose for myself. I don't want to progress by pushing others back. I just want not to be pushed down, not to be held back, not to be dehumanized. And I choose those ways of thinking that also liberate me from the internalized oppression of seeing myself as a racialized human being. To achieve freedom, I believe we need to focus on specific practices, because structures are not out there somewhere in some abstract space. They are in our heads, and they are in our hearts, and they are in the way that we relate to each other. which means that it is within our power to change these things. I am going to end with the words of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a Black psychiatrist who, rarely for a freedom fighter, died of natural causes. He dedicated his life to the fight for Black liberation. He lived and worked in Algeria during its period of struggle for independence. He was an incisive intellect and a true fighter. I hope that the words I'm going to read out, that I share with you here, will articulate stuff that I think he found very painful to write about. You can feel the pain in his words, his struggle to put into words things which are very uncomfortable to say and to give expression to. So here are his words. I am not a prisoner of history. I should not seek there for the meaning of my destiny. In the world through which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself. I am not the slave of the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. Was my freedom not given to me in order to build the world?